Welcome back, everybody, to Neutrality Studies. My name is Pascal Lotta, and I am joined again today by our good friend and colleague, Evarist Bartolo, a former foreign minister of the beautiful island nation of Malta. Evarist, welcome back.
Welcome. Thanks for this, Pascal.
A Easter Sunday talk as we speak on the 5th of April today. And we said we're going to use the occasion to discuss actually something very unpleasant, which is that last week we had a UN resolution that was taken. I'll try to show it here. Just a second. Here we go. This one here, a UN resolution that urged reparations for slavery and historical wrongs. Basically, a resolution saying that slavery was wrong and it would be condemned. And the good news is that the resolution, General Assembly resolution, passed. The bad news is that basically the way it passed is really a disgrace. So there were 3 votes against this resolution condemning slavery in the past, right? Argentina, Israel, and the United States. Right, those 3 voted outright against it, and then we had about 50 states 52 states that abstained. And if you look at them, it basically reads like the who is who of the former colonizing states or the white colonizers, basically all of Western Europe. Countries that voted for this are China and Russia and the entire former colonized world. So it's another one of these huge hypocrisies of the West at the moment. But yes, Evarist, what is your take on this resolution?
I agree with you, Pascal. It reads a bit like an X-ray, no? An X-ray of the geopolitical reality of today, showing us quite a lot, not about the past, I would say, but a lot about the present. Because, as you say, to have the 52 states that abstained, the core are all the 27 member states of the European Union. I'm ashamed to say that even tiny Malta, which had a past itself of thousands of Maltese dragged into slavery, like we were also involved in the slave trade, and Malta was one of the main slave markets in the Mediterranean, competing with Algiers and Istanbul. And although this resolution spoke about the Atlantic trade, the transatlantic trade, Portugal, Spain, the UK, France, the Netherlands, they were the main beneficiaries of this slave trade, because we cannot see it in isolation. It's not a standalone. You have to see it also within how it's entangled with colonialism and also with the industrialization of the West, because it all comes together. The slavery, apart from it being a very cruel side of human nature, where you actually say that you consider another fellow human being not as a fellow human being, but as your property, to do whatever you like with that property. Apart from that, I mean, really immoral attitude. It's also an economic reality. Slavery was a big money earner, both in terms of cheap forced labor, but also then in actually selling the slaves. If a slave owner bought the slave for 20 euros, they would sell it for over 300 euros. So it was a terrible reality. But what is more terrible is that after these centuries, after a century and a half, when slavery was abolished, and that's why the vote was taken on the 25th of March, because that coincides with the vote in the British Parliament to abolish slavery. We still, the West, the colonizers, still cannot bring themselves, I would say, not only not to confront the past, but also not to confront the present relationship that they have with Africa. If we're going to concentrate on Africa, because they still refuse to build an equal relationship with Africa. They still do not consider Africa an equal partner but still extracting mainly primary commodities, energy, and other raw materials from there. So it is a vote not only about the past. Unfortunately, it's very much also a vote about the present. Not to talk today, Pascal, of modern slavery, because that's also a reality.
Yeah, and it's a reality that we like to ignore, but also this reality that, the slave trade and the violence that the Europeans and the North Americans did to these other continents is still something that, the Europeans on the one hand say like, oh, it was regrettable that it happened. On the other hand, they are saying like, no, 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 it's long over and we learned our lesson. Da, da, da. But then they didn't. Then they
No,
vote for this. And maybe let me just to enrage you and I a little bit more. Let's read this passage. The UN very carefully in this article that they put up here. Actually, they quoted several people about who spoke, of course, in the General Assembly before the adoption of the resolution, and they are quoting. They just quoted and let it stand there. They quote the U.S. representative saying that. The U.S. representative, Mr. Ambassador Dan Negrea, said that the text was highly problematic in countless respects. And he regretted that Washington must once again remind his body that the United Nations exists to maintain international peace and security and was not founded to advance narrow, specific interests and agendas to establish niche international days or to create new costly meetings and reporting mandates. Niche, like tiny little particular interest, the tiny little particular interest of like 2/3 of the world
exactly.
to, or like 3/4 of the world to have recognized like hundreds of like years of absolute brutality that's done to them. Like they call that a tiny little narrow interest. Isn't it fantastic?
It's incredible. It's very cynical, because when you see what happened in those 400 years, even if we're going to concentrate now only on African slavery, um, we're talking about at least 50 million people. Why are we talking about 50 million people? The resolution and in the debate, the sort of usually they mention 12 million, 12.5 million people who actually made the passage from Africa to mostly to the Americas. But those 12 million people were the survivors of 50 million people,
Oh,
because a lot, millions died just making the trek on land. They had to walk something sometimes like 1,000 miles, and by the time they arrived to take the ships to cross over, they died in the desert. In fact, parts of the deserts are still white with the bones of these millions of slaves, and most of them were children and women and healthy men, because they made sure that before they started the trip, they selected them with very invasive, abusive modes of checking everything and checking everywhere to make sure that the bodies that they were going to ship over would be healthy bodies. And they left behind villages of old people, sick people, disabled people. Um, to call this narrow interests is really terrible. It's really terrible.
hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube. And although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below. And now back to the video. It's a quite sick mindset, right? But actually, the people who do this and say this, they understand, right? I mean, the fact that the Europeans were basically not able to vote against it, but had to abstain, tells us that they know that
Yes,
about their
it's
own
cover
guilt.
step,
But
making cover step.
it's quite interesting, though, how these how does it happen? I mean, you were a a foreign minister of Malta. I mean, how does it happen that then enough pressure is built up so that Malta does not vote in favor of this? Because Malta is like the last state who would have to fear that it would have to pay reparation, I suppose.
No,
Um,
exactly.
so
Exactly.
how
It's
does
a
it
block.
happen?
It's a block. It's a block. It's a block mentality, Pascal. From Brussels, there would be the line, let's stick together when we vote on this, because there are countries that are worried about reparations. But even that, I think, is unfair and unjust. That that not only are they not ready to apologize, and sometimes formally there is a little bit of apology, but I repeat, the attitude, the deeply ingrained attitude of consider Africans inferior is not something stuck in the past. If you look at the relationship that the European Union today has built with Africa, today in 2026, we're not talking about the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, 2026. It is completely lopsided, completely unequal, despite people like Juncker and Prodi saying we should build a partnership of equals and we should build a comprehensive agreement. It's not just taking commodities, it's not just taking energy out of Africa for our convenience, but also building equal relationships in industry, in agriculture, in banking services, in education, in technology. None of this has taken place. It's still going to Africa and getting out of Africa what you need. So the fact that you're not even ready to consider, because even notice how prudent and to a certain extent nearly apologetic the resolution is, because all it asks is to consider discussing what the slave trade meant, and then yes, to ask for reparation. It also talks about returning the objects that were taken from these colonies, to the colonizers. So I repeat, it is something that shows a lot still about the present and how difficult it is to build equal relations when the former colonizers still want to consider themselves superior to the rest. And I think it's a kind of narcissistic, ethnocentric Western attitude. Western civilization is superior in every area. So don't make us admit that yes, there's obviously good things, quite a lot of good things in Western civilization, but there are also terrible things that the West has to answer for and is still not ready to answer for.
Yeah, and also the idea that, nothing is owed for this, right? That this wrong of the past is a wrong that needs to remain in the past, and that shouldn't have any kind of influence on current relationships, while at the same time the mentality remains
Yeah,
very much
But
intact.
but apart from remaining the same, Pascal, what is very, very ironic is that when we talk of compensation, when the slave owners had to let go of their slaves because slavery started being abolished, even if you just look at the UK, not looking at other countries, who was compensated? In that case, there was
Yeah,
the slave owners. And the
yeah,
slave owners were given something like, I mean, we're talking of 20 billion.
yeah.
Apparently, it runs up to 20 billion euros given to the slave owners because they lost their slaves.
Property.
So when it comes to compensating the victims, no, 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 that's a problem. But those who
Yeah,
benefited,
and there are even more egregious examples, right? How, I mean, the first and most successful slave revolt in history was Haiti, right? That
yes,
successfully, where the slaves successfully managed to throw out the French, and in order for the French not to bomb them with their gunboats, they had to pay them millions
yes.
of francs at the time, and that's 200 years ago. And it just in order to basically buy back their freedom. And to this day, I must say I don't think that the Europeans and the Americans have forgiven Haiti, which is why they keep
Yes,
facing
yes.
such a very abysmal kind of circumstances. Do you have any thoughts on this one?
Yes, it's the usual approach, no, that we talk about liberty, fraternity, equality, but it has geographic limits, and it has human limits. If we're talking about our country, yes, let's talk about that. But then the same, idea of equal human beings who should live in dignity and who should have the liberty to run their own lives. No, that is not accepted because we want to exploit them. We want to make money out of them. And I think the same structure applies in different ways, but it's still the same. It's still the same structure, building and developing at your expense. I think one has to, I think, pay tribute to Guterres. I know he must be in a very difficult situation at the moment with the United Nations and the world being in the state that it is. But I think it is worth reading what he says, because I think it's very appropriate when he welcomed the vote, and I'm going to quote, he said, "The wealth of many Western nations was built on stolen lives and stolen labor." He talked about the barbaric punishments that maintained control, from shackles and iron collars to flogging and sexual violence. It was not simply forced labor, it was a machinery of mass exploitation and deliberate dehumanization of men, women, and children. The wounds run deep and often go unrecognized. I think those were very, very good, wise words. And the West is not ready to confront this reality. Now, whether you vote against or you abstain, it's still the failure to confront this reality. And what was and is still interesting is how such an attitude is deeply ingrained not only in politics and the economy, but also even in religion and culture. We read of um, priests who had and missionaries who had gone to Americas, and they write back to their bishops in Europe and ask them, what should we consider? How should we consider slaves? How should we treat slaves? And the answer used to come, don't you know, our learned people have said we should accept slavery, that it's part of today's reality, which is really terrible. There's also a very fallacious argument made by both the American representative and even when the EU spokesman, stated why the vote was one of abstention, saying that what was legal in the past, we shouldn't sort of answer for that. But even that is not true. Why? Because specifically how African slaves were treated, even in terms of the laws of those days, they were treated as inferior even to other slaves. White slaves were treated in a certain way, African slaves were treated in a different way, much more inferior, and the violence that was used against them, executions, flogging, cutting their noses and their ears, branding them on their breasts. I mean, it was terrible. So when there was the argument, we shouldn't have a hierarchy of violations, because calling slavery the gravest crime against humanity, it means it diminishes the crimes committed against others. I mean, how cynical to use an argument like this, because there was a hierarchy of violations. African slaves were treated worse than others. So to confront them and to start the debate and to start the discussion, it would be something healthy, Pascal, even for the African countries themselves, because this is a reality that they have to
Mhm.
confront, because Africans were complicit as well in during the wars that they used to have, to capture fellow Africans, and to sell them off for the slave trade. So this is a discussion and a debate that would be healthy for humanity in the world, not just for the West to confront its demons.
Yes, yes. Like in general, like, and something like what the South Africans had to do in order to confront their decades and decades, centuries of apartheid, right? And then have a process in which the victims and the perpetrators stand face to face to each other and actually get to some form of reconciliation with this. But even that is something that the Western countries at the moment reject, of course. Now, but one thing that is interesting about this resolution is, of course, let me look here, 123 votes in favor of it. So 2/3 of states in favor of it. And of course, in the United Nations General Assembly, the resolutions pass on, simple majority. And they are not binding, unfortunately. Only Security Council resolutions are binding, but the United Nations General Assembly has other powers, also in the sense of making international law, right? By the process through which these resolutions then become common law and whatnot. What do you think this tells us? Because there are quite a couple of resolutions that are kind of now going against the interest of certain groups. The other interesting one is, of course, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which was also taken against the interests of the great powers, even against the interests of China and Russia. And here we have a resolution that passes against the interests of this very, very powerful Western bloc. What does this tell you about the kind of the development and also the new courage of the rest to vote against the West? Because I believe a couple of decades ago, this resolution wouldn't have made it to the floor.
I see the same development in the Commonwealth, Pascal. The former colonies of the British Empire,
Mm.
organized in the British Commonwealth, have passed similar resolutions, much to the reluctance and also shock of
UK.
Britain,
Mm, mm,
of
mm.
Britain, and at least in that case, Malta sided with the Caribbean countries. So at least we absorbed a bit ourselves there, and the British were not very happy with us. Um, but it's also interesting talking about the Commonwealth, because the CARICOM countries in the Caribbean actually have also looked at practically how these reparations should be carried out. There was the argument, but who are we going to give this money to? As if they are already putting money together to start compensating slaves. You don't give them to individuals. The Caribbean countries have been very clear about this. Let's look at the debt structure, debt relief. Let's look at, investment in health, investment in education. So let's not use these kind of arguments to not do what needs to be done, and to help in such a debate build a more equal and a fairer world. And the General Assembly shows that that is the direction that a new United Nations should move towards, which is giving more power to the General Assembly, and less power, obviously, to those who have to have veto. Once I was joking with an American ambassador, saying that perhaps we should give veto to everyone except those who have the veto now, to be able to address the imbalance. Because for a fairer world, and an equal relationship between different states and between different countries, irrespective of size and power, that is the direction that we should go to. But I agree with you. These kind of votes, both in terms of the prohibition of nuclear weapons and in this case of slavery, like what had started happening even 60 years ago with the resolutions on colonialism. The impetus came actually from below, and that is, I think, a healthy sign that even in this case, a country like Ghana, for example, which is usually very, very prudent, and they were the leaders in this case, in this resolution, they were ready to push the boundaries and to assert themselves in something like this. I find it very, very healthy that at least it is being done, despite the UK, France, and the others push back, not to let it happen.
Yes, and I think this is actually an argument for why the United Nations today is not, at least not completely useless. I mean, this resolution will not have a direct impact today or tomorrow, but it very much gives us the direction, and it gives us a lot of information where the global opinions are going, and also how even smaller countries are able to assert themselves, how they are able to coordinate amongst themselves, and it gives a little bit of clarity, right? It strips away this masquerade of
Yeah.
the West going like, oh, we are a humanitarian superpower, and then even Sweden votes against this, right? You
Yes,
humanitarian
yes,
superpower. I mean,
yes,
Switzerland too voted against this. So
yes,
it's
yes.
like, okay, at least we can demask this stuff, because whenever push comes to shove and things actually count, then well, suddenly all of these values of yours are somewhere well hidden away in a dark corner of your office. So I mean, it's not completely useless. There
No,
is
no,
there is
I
the
agree.
General Assembly does a good job from time to time.
I agree. I agree completely, and it's also, I think, especially with the kind of ideology that is coming out of the United States, and the language, the violent language that you hear, and also the use of religion and Jesus Christ to justify, for example, the
Yeah,
war on Iran. I mean,
it's
it's just
insane.
terrible. The fact that then you have this kind of discussion shows, listen, we're not accepting that kind of approach and ideology. This has nothing to do with being woke. This has nothing to do with being politically correct. Let's treat each other as human beings, as equal human beings. But unfortunately, with the emphasis on domination, on supremacy, uh, it's part of the approach of I am superior to you. I do with you what I want, and you have to submit yourself to me. That is what those who want to dominate are afraid of. When those who have been subordinated for centuries say, we don't want to be subordinated anymore. Treat us as equals, and we're going to go on our road to, assert equality over dominance.
Yeah, and of course, it lays the foundation for more to come in the future, right? For the next resolution a few years down the line, and the next one and the next one, it builds up pressure on actually the dominating countries, especially the United States, right? On to drive home the point. No, I mean, this relationship, this way has to change, and if you're not willing, then we're just gonna keep doing this until the wave is big enough, until we win over country by country. So it's a very much part and parcel of the global democratic process among nations to kind of go into the direction that actually the majority wants to go. Interestingly enough.
Yes, and the importance is not to give up. Let's leave compensation, because trillions are mentioned on what proper compensation should look like. But even if you just look at the cultural artifacts that were stolen from the former colonies, now in this case, it's not to give them something; it's to give them what is theirs.
Yes.
It's not taking something, that you return. I mean, even that is still not resolved. Some countries have started giving back their the things that they stole.
Yeah.
Um, but even that, I repeat, shows the kind of how reluctant the West is to confront its colonial past, because I repeat, the slave trade and colonialism and capitalism go together.
How long do you think it will take until these kind of resolutions can be the foundation of, some of these countries then to unshackle themselves against the will of those who did shackle them? Because you talked about it in the beginning. um okay, slave trade and so on I mean, there are nobody does that anymore, but we very much invented all of these neo-colonial ways of domination, including, most importantly, of course, the debt. trap that the West plunged Africa and good parts of South America in, saying like, oh, you have to pay us back a debt in our own currency, which you will never be able to completely get. Therefore, we trap you in an eternal cycle of we give you something and then we demand that you give us your productive industries and let us extract resources in return for nothing. Really nothing. And right now, this system used to work because the US dollar was all dominant. There were no other alternatives, but now the alternatives are starting to pop up. So do you think that this could be used in the future for countries to say like, good, you know what? We're not going to pay you back. These debts we owe to you, you can you can just write them off. We're not going to pay them back, and if you try to punish us, we just go to the Chinese and the Russians because we have now this resolution saying like, right, we should be compensated. Do you think is something like that imaginable?
Yes, because dominance is built on coercion and consent. The more it's built on consent, being mobilized from the bottom, and the more countries are ready to say, listen, we've been so far dependent on the US, or we've been dependent on the Netherlands, on the UK, or on France. But now we are ready to build good relations with China, to build good relations with Russia, to build good relations with other countries, like the African countries are doing. Then yes, that's how they build their power to stand up to these countries. So I see it happening in Africa. The EU has, is absent in Africa, although it gives money and although it takes resources from there. It has no realistic, effective strategy for Africa. And obviously, compared to what Russia and compared to what China are doing, there's no comparison. So that has given these countries more say over their own destinies, and that is the way. I used to tell my friends and fellow ministers in the EU, if we do not work with Africa, the changes will come just the same. Without us, they will be against us. And it is so short sighted of the European Union, even not to take a vote, the opportunity for a vote like this to start a new relationship and to reset its relationship with Africa. It's another missed opportunity for the European Union. They should have taken this vote as a way to reset relations with Africa, because I agree with Juncker, what he said 8 years ago, that Europe's destiny is going to be shaped by Africa, whether Europe wants it or not. Just look at the demographics. Birth rate in Europe is about 1%. In Africa, it's 4%. By 2050, Africa will be 2.5 billion. So when they refuse to support a vote like this, I think they are being also short-sighted, even for their own interests. It's not just taking a moral attitude, but I think even in terms of practical benefits for the EU, they should have taken the opportunity of this vote to reset the relationship with Africa.
Yeah, yeah, it's absolutely. I mean, the demographic future of the planet lies in Africa and Asia. I mean, it's pretty simple because you can look at the graphs already. So, telling yet another generation of people in these other continents that we in Europe never respected them and still don't respect them and still think that nothing is owed to any of them, and that we deserve everything we have and we did it all ourselves. I mean, yeah, we just shouldn't be surprised if in 20, 30 years down the road, when we need help, they will say like, you know what, just stick
Yes,
it
yes.
out over there in that cold, grim, ghastly continent and just rot over there, right?
What is worrying is that these countries in decline, these former powers in decline, resort to military power to try
Yeah.
and prolong their dominance. And this is what is happening in the war against Iran. It has nothing to do with being nice to the Iranians to bring about a better system for there. It's just to prolong hegemony, it's just to prolong dominance. And anyone who tries to, to stand up for his and her dignity should be pushed down and know its place. Unfortunately, I repeat, this vote shows where we still are. So in
Yes.
terms of the US, Israel, and Argentina, there is no doubt, voting against. Europe has started making a timid half step to say, yes, you're right, but. Well, I think the reality of the coming years will help to build a more assertive majority of the
Mhm.
world, because we're talking here of the majority of the world. But there still needs to be changes in economics, in technology, in military power, so that countries who so far have had to subordinate themselves will not beg for equality, because if you beg for equality, it doesn't happen. It's just you keep on developing, building relations with different countries so that you are not dominated anymore by the former colonizers.
Yes, yes, but this is the way that it is going, right? It's not going to be a process that's going to be won by
No,
moral or virtuous
no,
arguments. It's a process that's going to be driven by realist foreign policy, and the realism dictates that these oppressed countries, that they're coming out of it, and they're working themselves out of this kind of oppression, and these kind of resolutions are now one of the signs that there's seriously something changing. And same with the Iran war, same with the Ukraine war, right? It's now the second after the Ukraine war, the war in Iran. It's the second time the this Western alliance of states of mentality, this Western civilization is kind of the political West, as Richard Sakwa calls it, is kind of running against the wall and getting a very bloody nose. It's still other people paying the price and bleeding for these imperial interests, but it's just not really working anymore. Even the approach of using brute force, is it?
yes, and the elites make their own people pay as well, because if you look at what's happening in the European continent, also what's happening in the United States, I mean, the money that is being spent on the military is very much needed at home in terms of social services, in terms of education, in terms of health. I mean, Trump has just given a speech saying, "Don't talk about medical care, because now we have to, spend money on military protection." I mean, the same argument is being made in Europe. This is very suicidal and very selfish and very painful for millions of citizens. So the elites make this argument, but millions of citizens are not impressed anymore by that kind of argument, because if before it was more possible, not that it's not now, but it was more possible to have the barbarians at the gate and say, "Listen,
Yes.
listen, the Russians are coming, the Chinese are coming, the Iranians are coming, the mad mullahs are
Yep.
coming, the terrorists are coming." But now, I think more people are realizing that the money that you're spending is not to keep the enemy out, but to have a small elite which is making money from AI, military industrial complex, and the hangers on, and to give money to them, and not for the a decent life in everyday life for millions of human beings.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, at some point, everything that's going on at the moment is, of course, also aimed at keeping these large majorities within the West, especially the United States, down, right? And
Yes.
I believe there will be a point when actually a good number of the really disadvantaged classes in the US will actually understand that they have more in common with a lot of people in Africa and Asia and South America than they have with their own elites. And that will be the point where it will get really dangerous for the elites, when suddenly there's an awakening that oh, wait a minute, we're being had, and maybe instead of bombing the others, maybe we just team up and change a few things here or there.
It is interesting what you're saying, because even during the slave trade, what really used to terrify the slave owners was when Africans and white workers in the United States and in other American countries actually came together and saw that they had common challenges and a common enemy. And that is where the elites used to. That is why when it came to the slave trade and the way they treated African slaves was so vicious and violent, because they wanted to keep on dividing them. And they used to say, if you're white, yes, we will punish you. But if you are black, we will punish you and even, execute you. So yes, it's the solidarity of the people that the elites are afraid of.
Yeah, it's in a sense the question is like how to foster the solidarity amongst the people in the former in the oppressor states and the former enslaving states and the solidarity with the people in the states that were exploited in order to finally once and for all get.
Well, I think what helps, Pascal, is that if you impoverish your own people, they will feel closer to those
Oh
who
yeah,
are impoverished in other
oh yeah.
countries. If you are a beneficiary of how you're exploiting others, you don't have solidarity. But I think this will come about. This will come about, especially today, where, at least so far, the new social media and the new forms of communication make horizontal communication across countries easier. Though I'm sure that the elites who control these systems
Yeah.
will try to make sure that they inhibit that kind of transversal communication among the people who are oppressed in different countries.
Yes, they have to. They must crack down on this vertical, on this horizontal kind of way of communication. It is the logical next step they have to take to protect this elite kind of circles, right? From the peasants, from
Exactly.
from from
Exactly.
us. Like, how dare we to have even such ideas? I mean, come on.
Yes,
The Elon Musk and the others, they sweat a lot, and the billionaires, they are billionaires because they worked so much and because they're genius, not because they suck the lifeblood out of everybody else.
exactly.
It's a very old
Exactly.
story.
It
Evarist,
is. It is.
something more that you think is significant about this story, or did we about cover it?
No, it shows that even though steps, move slowly and are small, it is important not to give up. Even though in 2026, this is what we've managed to do so far, it's important to keep on pushing and never to give up. I think that's the message that should come out of this vote.
That's a very, very good way of tying everything up. We will be in a better place in 21, 26. So 2026, we're just not at the end of everything. We're not the pinnacle yet. So we're just working toward it. Um, and this was a lot of clarity. So Evarist Bartolo, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.